Welcome, my friends. I'm your host, Jared Bollman. This is Biblically Speaking, and I am so glad you are here. I've been looking forward to hanging out with you all week, and Wednesday's show was a debacle. It's still not up. It will be up this afternoon, but man, we were just plagued with some technical difficulties, and you'll see what I mean when you see the episode. But this is for you. And I never want to forget that you are what this show is all about. It's not about the production value. It's not about how many subscribers or likes that it gets. It is for you. Yes, you. So I want to do sort of a redo of some of the stuff that I talked about on Wednesday that you still haven't seen, maybe in addition to that. And our whole discussion today is going to be why it is rational for you to believe in God. Now, one of the things that I talked about on Wednesday is that there is an increasing sentiment in this country that belief in God is not rational, that it is foolish for adults to believe in a supreme being, and yet I would submit to you that it's quite the opposite. And we're going to do that with Genesis 1. I want to suggest that we learn three things from Genesis 1, and I'm going to break up the reading of Genesis 1 across these 3 points. But the first one is that Genesis 1 tells us how we came to be. Now, this is interesting for a religious text to do, to give us kind of a unified theory of how we came to be. And it's something that science has long looked for, that we look for this kind of explanation. We look in a lot of different places for it, and yet Genesis 1 tells us that in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And that's significant, that is the first, before light is spoken into existence, we have God creating this formless earth and the formless heavens because it's a blank canvas that he's going to place the rest of his creation upon. And when you understand that, what you see is that creation is intentional. It's not accident. That God created the heavens and the earth for a purpose, and we're going to get into that in just a moment. But it's not a purpose that man defines himself, but rather it's one that God defined from that statement that he did this in the beginning. But before we get into that, let's actually look at what that text says. The text says, "In the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. Now the earth was formless and empty. Darkness covered the surface of the watery depths. And the Spirit of God was hovering over the surface of the water. Then God said, 'Let there be light.' And there was light. And God saw that the light was good. And God separated the light from the darkness. And God called the light day, and the darkness he called night. And there was evening, and there was morning one day. Then God said, 'Let there be an expanse between the waters, separating the expanse from the water above and the expanse and above the expanse.' And it was so. And God called the expanse sky. Evening came, and then morning the second day. Then God said, 'Let the water under the sky be gathered into one place, and let the dry land appear.' And it was so. And God called the dry land earth. And the gathering of the water he called the seas. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, 'Let the earth produce vegetation, seed-bearing plants and fruit trees, on the earth bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds.' And it was so. And the earth produced vegetation, seed-bearing plants according to their kinds, and tree-bearing fruit with seed in it according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Evening came, and then morning the third day. Then God said, 'Let there be lights in the expanse of the sky to separate the day from the night, and they will serve as signs for seasons and for days and years. And there will be lights in the expanse of the sky to provide light on the earth.' And it was so. And God made the two great lights, the greater light to rule over the day, and the lesser light to rule over the night, as well as the stars. And God placed them in the expanse of the sky to provide light on the earth, to rule the day and the night, and to separate the light from the darkness. And God saw that it was good. Evening came, and then morning the fourth day." So we had that statement again, in the beginning, God created the heavens and the earth. And what we see is that you have first cause there. That in order for there to be a creator, he has to exist outside of space. He has to exist outside of time. He has to exist outside of matter. And what you see is that God created all three of those things on the first day. Now, there is no theory that man has ever concocted or explored for creation, for a reason for being here, that explains how all of these things came into existence. In fact, if you look at the prevalent theory of the Big Bang, it is essentially the theory that from nothing came everything for no reason. And that doesn't really fit with what you see when you look around. You see, that says accidental. And yet what you see over and over again is that nothing in the world that we live in is accidental. I mean, we do accidents. I mean, accidents happen. But if you look at the predictability of the world that we live in, I mean, what did he tell us there? That the lights were going to govern the changing of the seasons, that they were there to mark time, that man was going to live his life even before man was introduced, that we were going to be marking the years by the sun and the moon, and the seasons by the sun and the moon, the harvest and things like that. And it was all put into God's design from the beginning. Think about how many accidents without a designer would have to take place to reach a point where giant squirrels playing on branches over there, to reach a place where you and I have a habitable place to live. How many things have to be designed, well, we won't use the word design because we're considering this without God. How many things have to happen by happenstance in order for you and I to survive on this planet for any length of time at all? And yet, that's the prevailing wisdom, is that given enough time, all of these accidents will come together in just the perfect way. And that's really, and I mentioned this on the Wednesday program, that's really a statement of faith, because you can't prove that. You can't prove that given enough time, all of these things will accidentally come together. And forget just the conditions for life. Think about the conditions in your body. You know, David said, I am fearfully and wonderfully made. Think about your cellular structure. Think about, the eye of man, that they say evolved over time from being one that was primarily night vision to one that can see colors in great depth that we can now. And think about how many generations and permutations had to happen for your eye to become what it is. Think about how many microevolutionary changes and how none of those changes would have been beneficial until you get the fully functioning color eye. None of those changes are beneficial. And how you would have had to have two of the same species with the exact same mutation breeding with each other and becoming the predominant species or the predominant representation of that species. You don't get that in billions of years. And why is it when we see genetic mutation today, we don't see genetic mutation that makes life better? There's no extra digits. We're not being genetically mutated to have a third arm. When we see genetic mutation today, it always presents itself as illness, and it never becomes the predominant trait. As far back as we can trace human history, we don't see that. What we see is design. A separate show coming up on design and order, and it's going to be an entire episode, so I don't want to spend too much more time on that. But our second reading is going to come starting in verse 20. And from there, we're going to talk about not just design, but how life propagates. Then God said, let the water swarm with living creatures, and let the birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created the large sea creatures, and every living creature that moves and swarms in the water according to their kind. He also created every winged creature according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them. Be fruitful, multiply, and fill the waters of the seas, and let the birds multiply on the earth. And evening came, and then morning, the fifth day. Because when I was in grade school, I was told that we evolved from a species of apes closely related to the chimpanzee. I mean, that was even as far back as the 80s and 90s. When I was in school, they were not really even allowing for the idea of creation to be taught in the public school system. It could be mentioned, but not really taught. Now I think it's probably a little less supported than even that. But I want to stop and think about this idea that we just saw. Which is more provable? Which is more relatable? If you're sitting and thinking about it, you and I are sitting down, we're sharing a cup of coffee, and we're talking about, what can we observe about creation? Which one is observable? That we see life reproducing after its own kind, or we see life mutating in ways and evolving from creature to creature. This is something I brought up in the Wednesday video, and I think it probably got a little cut up because of the audio. But I want to say this very clearly. It's always strange to me that when you look at like Australopithecus, the Lucy skeleton that I talked about, that when you look at the jump between the chimpanzee and Australopithecus, and then you started crossing into the I think it was Homo erectus came next, and then that began the species of man that supposedly evolved over several orders into Homo sapien. I forget how that all weighs out. I'd have to go back and look at it again. Why is it that the thing that's always supposed to be the link between two species, why don't we ever find that anymore? I mean, we can find the earlier species. I went to the zoo just a few days ago and watched some chimps playing around with a blanket because they were cold. You know, and I've been and seen the great apes in different zoos. You know, I can go and see different generations of and breeds of big cats in the same zoo. Where are the missing links that are the crossovers between species? Where are those definitive, here's proof that this has both the DNA and the characteristics of both man and animal? You hear that same thing with the dinosaur, that dinosaurs evolved into modern day birds. It used to be modern day lizards, now it's birds. I think it may be back to lizards again. I saw something on that the other day. But we always heard about that the evolution of the dinosaur into the modern day lizard and then bird, and whichever, maybe it's bird lizard now. Where's that crossover? I mean, true, we don't see living dinosaurs anymore because they're long extinct. But if I can find earlier examples in the genetic rung, and I can find later examples in the genetic rung, how come you and I can't go to the zoo and see Neanderthal, Cro-Magnon, if they're really different species? Why is it that I can't go and see Australopithecus? Why is it always that species that's died out? The answer is simple. There's not a change in species. It was just a different form of animal, just like Neanderthal was probably just a group of humans that had different traits. And we can try to label how far back they lived, but the one thing we can't really do is look into their DNA because it doesn't exist anymore. And yet this is being offered as definitive proof that man evolved naturally as opposed to being created by God. And the problem that I have with that is there is no definitive proof there because I can't observe it. Science is supposed to be observable. You and I should be able to observe this, right? But we can't. And no, Darwin's evolution of the species or order of the species is not proof of one species becoming another. It might be proof that birds develop different kind of beaks. It might be proof that God created birds with different kinds of beaks for different kinds of environments. But it does not prove that one species evolves from another. It just doesn't. Look at the sixth day of creation, because that's the big one. That's when animals and man are created, when the cattle and the beasts of the field were created. These are the highest orders in the species that we see. Man himself is said to be made in God's own image. What do we learn from that sixth day? Well, let's read it. Let the earth produce living creatures according to their kinds, the livestock, creatures that crawl, and wildlife of the earth according to their kinds, and it was so. So God made the wildlife of the earth according to their kinds, the livestock according to their kinds, and all the creatures that crawl on the ground according to their kinds. And God saw that it was good. Then God said, "Let us make man in our image according to our likeness, and they will rule the fish of the sea, the birds of the sky, the livestock, the whole earth, and the creatures that crawl on the earth." So God created man in his own image. He created him in the image of God. He created them male and female. God blessed them, and God said to them, "Be fruitful and multiply. Fill the earth and subdue it. Rule the fish of the sea and the birds of the sky and every creature that crawls on the earth." And God also said, "Look, I have given you every seed-bearing plant on the surface of the entire earth, and every tree whose fruit contains seed, and these will be food for you, for all the wildlife of the earth, for every bird of the sky, every creature that crawls on the earth, and everything having breath in it. And I have given every green plant for food, and it was so. And God saw all that he made, and it was very good. And evening came, and the morning, the sixth day. So the heavens and the earth and everything in them were completed on the seventh day. God completed his work that he had done, and he rested on the seventh day from all the work he had done. So what we learned from the sixth day is that God created man in his image, and he gave him purpose. So not only do we see design, not only do we see order, not only do we get an explanation for why life is able to continue here, but we're given a purpose. How about that? That's one thing we're not going to get from the order of the species. We get purpose. Our purpose is to glorify God by subduing the earth. The purpose of animals was to glorify God by filling the earth and reproducing after its own kind. So what do we see there? Well, what we see is that God, in doing this, what we learn in the next chapter, is he designed it so that man can be fulfilled in that purpose through the family unit. That's there in Genesis. Not a lot of other creation accounts and man-made religions come up with that kind of thought, because there aren't any gods in those religions that show any real compassion or concern for the people that they supposedly created. And yet, right from the beginning, God is looking at Adam in Genesis 2. He says it's not good for man to be alone. So he created Eve. And he brought them together, and the two became one. And their purpose was to rule over the earth that God created. Their purpose was to reproduce after their kind. And that explains so much. And it also explains why our culture is so bent on going into atheism, because it doesn't want to fulfill that purpose. If man is just another animal, then the obligations that he has in those regards don't matter anymore. If man isn't a created thing, he's an evolved thing, then morality doesn't matter anymore. And that's really what's at the bottom of all of this. So the question is, if we look at what we see today in the world around us, if we look at how life continues, if we look at how babies are born, if we look at the fact that the seasons continue just as they always have, and that we look to the sun and the moon to define the times of year that we're living in, if we can see, as Isaiah talked about, God's sitting above the circle of the earth. That doesn't mean that God thinks the earth is a circle instead of a sphere. It means he's watching over the circuit of the earth. Isaiah's talking about that before he understood planetary motion. Before people understood planetary motion, he's saying God sits above the circuit of the earth. He's watching the earth move in its rotation. Now, David, when he wrote the Psalms, thought the sun went up and down in the sky. God knew better, and he speaks it through his prophet. So if we can see all of this in the Bible, which is the more rational claim? The one that says, I know this is how we came to be, but I can't prove it because there's no real evidence of it. I can interpret evidence and say it means that, but there's no real evidence of it. Or is the more rational claim that there is a God who exists outside of time and space, who set this universe to operate just the way he intended it to, and it's still operating in that way. Now, one of the reasons why I wanted to do this outdoors is because it is the fall in the Pacific Northwest. You probably saw some trees behind me that had these wonderful yellow leaves on them, and they're about bare. You know why? Because it's the changing of the seasons. And we were able to predict that. We knew right when it was coming, because it's always come. And that, my friends, is the first proof of why it is rational and even wonderful to believe in God. Well, thank you for being here. I know this might not have been the video you expected, but I hope you got something out of it. I got something out of planning it. But as always, have a good day, and God bless.